welcome to our interview series for our MOOC, our massive open online course, Europe Without Borders. And today I'm very pleased to be joined by our distinguished guest, who is David Vaughan.
Hello.
Hello. And David is a writer, a broadcaster, a journalist and a university lecturer. He's been based in Prague in the Czech Republic for roughly 30 years. And his interests are many and varied, including Czechoslovak history in the interwar period, and David has written about that, especially the role of broadcast media and the lead up to the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia. As a radio correspondent, David travelled widely in the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Ukraine, and has interest in the history, the politics, the culture of all of these places. So, David, welcome and thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
So since we are here in Prague and we're filming this interview in Prague, I do want to start with Czech culture and specifically Czech literary culture. Well, we'll find out if it's Czech literary culture. But so was Franz Kafka, right, a famous son of Prague, was Franz Kafka a Czech writer?
That's a great question. By most people's definition, he isn't a Czech writer for the simple reason that he didn't write in Czech. Mm-hmm. He was born in Prague at a time in the 1880s when the city was overwhelmingly Czech-speaking, okay, but there was a German-speaking minority to which he belonged. His family came from the area not far from Prague, which was also predominantly Czech-speaking, but they also spoke German. But the whole family would have, despite having German as their native tongue, would have also spoken very good Czech. Mm-hmm. The very name Kafka is actually a Czech word with a slightly different spelling, Kafka with a V. It means jackdaw. Okay. And the family was Jewish as well, which is also another factor. And Kafka, as a writer, and personally was very interested in his Jewishness. He also took an interest in Zionism. And so the answer to that question is very complicated. And of course, also, you have to ask the question, well, if he's writing in German, is he a German writer? And he never lived in Germany. He was born in Prague at a time when it was part of the Austrian Empire. He had, after Czechoslovakia came into being, he had a Czechoslovak passport. And so he was never a German. And also by the definition, by Hitler's ultra-nationalist definition of what makes a German, because he was Jewish, of course, he was also not defined as a German. So I think the answer to the question is that, like so many great writers, he belongs in several places at once, and that's probably what makes Kafka such a great writer.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. I mean, several places at once, and then the kind of tragic side is in somehow nowhere, right?
And also somewhere, because he was born and lived all his life in Prague, which is really quite provincial in a sense. Yeah. So he's both a world citizen and a person who didn't travel a great deal. He travelled within Austro-Hungary, he travelled to Berlin, but Prague was always his home. So it wasn't as if he wasn't rooted, it was just that he was an outsider.
Yeah, okay, fascinating. And so, I want us to kind of get into these issues about national identity and language and culture and, and the kind of relation between the Czech nation and the German nation. But so, is there a Czech, because you point out, of course, rightly, that he wrote in German and yes, that in some ways excludes him from being a Czech writer, but is there a Czech national literature in German?
Basically, the simple answer to that is no. Because at the time of the Czech national revival through the 19th century, when Czech really re-emerged as a literary language, it was pretty much what defined Czech literature was the fact that it was in Czech. And there were many people who spoke both languages, but their Czechness they would define through writing in Czech. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, they were all living in the same place. Everybody was at home in the same place, whether they spoke Czech or German. So there's a huge cross-fertilization between German and Czech in terms of the literature. And there was a rivalry which was, for most of the history of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, was mostly friendly. It wasn't, it was not, well, friendly is a slight exaggeration, but there was this non-violent rivalry
not hostile,
between,
would you say?
Not hostile.
Okay.
There was a degree of hostility, and also historically, there are so many figures in the history of these lands, Bohemia and Moravia, that are shared. You know, for example, the Emperor Charles IV in the 14th century, who both German speakers and Czech speakers would be happy to claim as their own. And so it is an interesting question. I mean, and writers were interested to a certain extent what was going on, what Czech writers were interested in, what German writers were writing, German writers in German were interested in what Czech writers were writing. But there was also a tendency with this competition, there was also a tendency for Czechs at the time of the national revival to look elsewhere, to think, you know, we want to come out of these years of dominance by the German language, so we're going to look further. And so, for example, there was a huge amount of interest in the beginning of the 20th century in French culture and literature, and art. For example, Cubism became a major movement here. Surrealism, which also had its roots in France, became a major element in Czech literature and art. And people would travel to Paris. Guillaume Apollinaire, the French poet, famously came to Prague and fell in love with Prague, which was something that also was an impulse to Czechs to take an interest in French poetry. And also there was an interest in Britain, there was an interest in America, in American culture, not least because the American president Woodrow Wilson played a significant role in the fact that Czechoslovakia came into being in 1918, and so there was a sense of identity or gratitude as well to the Americans.
Okay, yeah. So, and yeah, I mean, you mentioned Cubism, and of course, Prague is famous as one of the few places that has examples of Cubist architecture, right? So yeah, that's and yeah. So you've kind of established, and so language then is really central to this project of Czech nation building, right? Which is not inevitable. You know, you take another case like Ireland, right, where the national literature is to a large extent in English, right? So it's not kind of inevitable, but obviously that was central to Czech nation building. And so, you know, that's what I wanted to ask about again, this relationship between the Czech nation and the German nation. You know, to what extent was the Czech nation, could you say, built in opposition to the German nation? Right? This is what we are not.
Again, I've never addressed that question a bit already, but I think that there was, for a start, it's not necessarily the German nation. We're talking about Austro-Hungary.
Yes.
And there is a clear distinction between Austro-Hungary as this very complex state of many identities, many languages, many cultures, many religions, and it wasn't necessarily German, despite the predominant language or the language of government being mainly German. So the question of this opposition between Czech and German is more complicated in that respect. Also, traditionally German was the language of Prague's Jews as well. So there's yet another level.
Yes.
And yet, at a time when in various parts of Europe there was this revival of interest in national identities.
And again, sorry, we're dating
nations.
this to, you know, like the late 19th century.
We're going back to the
19th
beginnings of the 19th century.
Okay.
It sort of started with theatre, and it started with this shift from Czech being a language that had survived in the country to becoming an urban language. And really, in the space of just 2 generations, in the course of the 19th century, Czech went from being the minority language in Prague to being the language of the overwhelming
that's fascinating, in 2 generations. So this is a concerted nation building.
It was a concerted nation building, but people would have still spoken German to a greater or lesser extent as well, because there was a significant German-speaking minority, and also there was power. The power was in Vienna.
Yes, as you mentioned, the language of administration of the imperial capital, right, in Vienna.
And it's also, I think, a reason why there was such a huge Czech blossoming of culture in the second half of the 19th century. If you think about 2 of the best known of all Czechs composers, Bedřich Smetana and Antonín Dvořák, from that period. And I think that was partly because as long as the seat of power was in Vienna, then the way that you could, in an unrestricted way, express your nationhood was through culture. And you only just have to look, for example, just behind us, that extremely grand building, is the National Museum, and it was really a gesture of Czech pride in their nation.
When was that built?
That was built in the 1880s, and so it's also an expression not only of Czech pride, even though it had its roots in a more inclusive Bohemian Czech and German identity, but that's going further back in its history. So on the one hand, it's a gesture of Czech pride in the city and the nation. Also, it's a symbol of wealth.
Yes.
It's a fact that, you know, we're not only a nation, but we're also doing rather well.
Yes.
You know, look at the gilding.
Yeah.
And that was a major factor in the Czech national revival as well in the 19th century, that this part of Central Europe was developing very quickly in terms of industry.